Hello patrons, Rob Caskie, proudly engaging in storytelling, and today I would like to share a little bit with you about a great South African called young Christian Smuts. A few years ago we did a road trip down into the Cape to visit Riebeek Wes and indeed Riebeek Kasteel, where young Christian Smuts was born in 1870, 24th of May 1870. And isn't it wonderful to consider that this great man was born in the shadow of that great mountain, Riebeek Kasteel, that indeed stands way above the flat wheatlands all around it, and that young Smuts would indeed become a man who probably towered, in my opinion, above humanity in his lifetime. Well, he grew up in the wheatlands of the Western Cape, Riebeek Kasteel, where Dutch culture created a situation where the oldest boy, his brother Michiel, was the favored one and the one indeed who would be given an education. They were a farming family. The resources were not present to afford all the kids an education. And Michiel unfortunately died of tuberculosis. And with that, the mantle of education came to rest upon the shoulders of a young 12-year-old young Smuts, a boy who had once been attacked by a Smuts' dog. Now, Smuts were traders who used to travel around all over the Cape with wagons, selling goods to outlying areas and farmers and settlers, the goods that they didn't have usual access to. The one thing that was always very popular were raisins and sultanas to improve the quality of their bobotie, a Cape Malay dish that has become part of South African national cuisine. And this Smuts arrived with a dog that was very aggressive, probably didn't like youngsters, and attacked young Smuts. Jan, as a result, had a great fear of dogs for the rest of his life, a man who, in my opinion, was afraid of very little. Everyone said he was a man who never showed fear in any situation, but he always maintained a great fear of dogs for the rest of his life. And upon the death of his brother Michiel, young Smuts went to school, aged 12. Probably hard to believe that he completed our national curriculum in 4 years. Graduated well enough at age 16 to be given a scholarship to attend the University of Stellenbosch, Victoria College, and to read law, which he graduated from with 2 first-class honours, an incredible feat. Clearly a man who was blessed with a quite insatiable mind for knowledge. He had a photographic memory and exercised these traits to the utmost. Jan Smuts was a great botanist and loved the study of botany and all things natural, and realized that if you wanted to make a detailed study of botany and understand it well, you had to be able to understand, read, and comprehend Latin. Do you know that he locked himself away in a room and taught himself Latin in 10 days? He said to the day he died that it was the greatest feat of memory he ever achieved. Well, Jan Smuts emerged from university to become invited through the Ebden Scholarship to attend Cambridge University. He sold some of his cattle that he had been building up to afford studies in England, because the Ebden Scholarship did not cover his entire study requirements in England. He was lucky enough to be enrolled at Christ's College, and when he expressed concern regarding his financial restraints, a wonderful Professor Marais lent him a great deal of money to continue his studies without concern that he would one day repay. Well, young Smuts went on to say that his years at Cambridge College were the greatest years of his life. He integrated very well into the English community, the English scholarly system, and was indeed to be acknowledged in 500 years of Cambridge University's existence as one of their 3 greatest scholars and minds, along with John Milton, Charles Darwin, Jan Smuts. Now that alone should tell you a great deal about the man. He returned, having studied so well at Cambridge, to become a lawyer in the Cape. With his time in England, he was well disposed towards the British and the British culture and the British way of doing things. And he was very impressed with the De Beers Company and with Cecil John Rhodes. And he became a lawyer in the De Beers Company and was absolutely outraged, felt enormously betrayed by Rhodes, by the failed Jameson raid, December of 1895, January of 1896. He immediately resigned his position from De Beers and was lucky enough to become the state attorney of the Transvaal, the South African Republic, which at the time was being led by none other than Stephanus Johannes Paulus Creer, Paul Kruger, perhaps one of the greatest beings the Boer nation ever produced, a quite astute president of the Transvaal or South African Republic. Well, with tensions growing, with a huge number of foreigners or Uitlanders as they were called, coming into South Africa after the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand by George Harrison in 1886, Paul Kruger knew that if these foreigners or Uitlanders were given the vote, they could simply vote his country away from him, and the tensions were rising. The British had sent out a commissioner to South Africa called Sir Alfred Milner, and Milner was to meet at a peace convention created with the Boers in Bloemfontein in May of 1899. And there is no doubting, all the literature I've read on the subject would indicate that Milner was incredibly threatened and indeed dominated by the intelligence and the personality of young Christian Smuts, and I think felt enormously threatened by it. Well, it was young Christian Smuts' duty to indeed draft the ultimatum that would be issued to the British in October of 1899 regarding the fact that if their garrisons who'd been moved so provocatively up to the Transvaal border and their garrisons who'd been moved from their peacetime stations and were now on the high seas on ships on their way to South Africa were not turned around and returned to their peacetime stations, the South African Republic would consider itself at war with the Great British Empire. Well, war was ultimately proclaimed on the 11th of October of 1899, and that is one of the great Goliath and David stories that we will probably go through in subsequent lectures. Isn't it wonderful to consider that young Christian Smuts had been so important and central to the creation of self-government in the Transvaal in 1906 and indeed in the Free State in 1907. And President Steyn, who was president of the Orange Free State, knew that their independence was inextricably linked with that of the Transvaal. Steyn, I must add, was violently opposed to a war with Britain. But he knew that if the Transvaal went to war with Britain, the Free State had to go in too. Because if the Transvaal lost their independence, the Free State would lose theirs. Well, isn't it stunning to consider that Paul Kruger would meet with four famous Boer generals, being De Wet, De la Rey, Smuts, and Louis Botha, and try to shame them when they were still talking for peace, trying to avoid a war with Britain. And it was Koos de la Rey, who was a powerful man, who stood up and slammed his big fist into the table, and he said, You people who make war with your mouths looking straight at Paul Kruger, you will be long gone from this country when we are still fighting for peace and our independence on the veldt of South Africa. Well, isn't it tragic to consider that whilst those bitter enders, as they became known, the bitter enders, were still fighting for their independence in this country, Paul Kruger would die in exile in Switzerland. Well, young Smuts committed himself with acclaim in the Anglo-Boer War. He, along with De Wet, De la Rey, and Botha, emerged as four of the great generals on the side of the Boers. These younger men were very frustrated by the philosophies of the older generals like Joubert and Cronje, who said with a largely religious bent that if God gives you a finger, you don't take the hand. And many of the younger generals said that might be a fine philosophy in life, but certainly not a fine philosophy when you're waging war. Well, eventually, with the scorched earth policy in this country, the concentration camps, and the destruction of the Boer nation as it was known. Young Smuts would eventually call the other generals together and say, look, we have shown the British how we can fight a war. 22,000 armed farmers being chased around South Africa by 450,000 trained British soldiers, and the British being made to look the laughing stock. He said, we've shown the British how we can fight a war. Now we're going to show the British how we can broker a peace. And in May of 1902, peace was eventually brokered at the Treaty of Vereeniging. And isn't it incredible that it was Horatio Kitchener who convinced Smuts that there was no doubt going to be a more liberal government in Britain, and that more liberal government would give independence, autonomy to the Free State and the Transvaal. And that if the peace was formally concluded, that process would be accentuated, but the black question had to be left off the table. Jan Smuts was convinced by his great confidant and friend, Louis Botha. 8 years his senior, Louis Botha was an amiable, wonderful man who hailed from Greytown in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands. And he and Smuts had the most incredible relationship. Smuts always said, I dealt with the politics, Botha dealt with the people. Botha was an arbitrator, a negotiator, a man of musical bent, and clearly these two formed a formidable team, both blessed with a quite prodigious ability to work, particularly for the good and the future of South Africa. And on those terms, eventually the peace was brokered, and on went South Africa, with the Free State and the Transvaal being given their independence effectively in 1906 and 1907, and then with a more liberal government back in Britain, Campbell Bannerman, came the Union of South Africa in 1910 with Louis Botha as Prime Minister, and Smuts was given very, very powerful portfolio of defence and education. Well, he dealt brutally with miners' uprisings, and indeed with black uprisings that preceded the war in this country. And I don't think that Smuts was ever forgotten for the way in which he handled those strikes or uprisings. And then it was that famous General Smith-Dorrien, who was to become ill and be treated in Cape Town, that created an opening for young Smuts to go up and lead a huge number of Allied troops, many of them South African, in East Africa, Tanganyika as it was known, now Tanzania, against that great German von Lettow Vorbeck. Well, it was a logistical supremo that Smuts arranged in terms of creating the troops and moving them all up into East Africa. It was a very difficult campaign. The Koenigsberg gave them all sorts of issues in the Rufiji Delta. A famous South African, Pretorius, was to scout and find out exactly where the Koenigsberg was hiding out, and they were eventually able to destroy it with long-range fire from other British cruising warships. Well, young Smuts emerged well from the First World War. I need to add that he went on to great acclaim, because it was he and Botha who convinced South Africa, after the German aid to the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, that we indeed needed to go into the war on the side of the Allies and not on the side of the Germans. How different history may have been if South Africa had gone into that war on the side of the Germans. Well, when the Peace of Versailles was signed, it was young Smuts who was so violently opposed to the very punitive terms of that treaty. He said that the terms were so punitive that they would indeed lead to a Second World War. How ironic that prediction was to be. He said that the Allies now, from a position of strength, needed to negotiate and treat reasonably the Germans. That sentiment was not shared by others, and eventually he would resign from the War Cabinet and become central to the creation of the Charter of the United Nations, a remarkable formation of nations and an agreement that still carries enormous weight around the world to this day. Well, Jan Smuts came back to South Africa. He would eventually be elected as Prime Minister upon the death of Louis Botha, his great friend and confidant, in 1919. And I think with Botha gone, Smuts lost some of the sounding board that he relied on so strongly and some of the rudder that he enjoyed so strongly in the form of his great friend Louis Botha. So on goes the situation in South Africa with tremendous developments in our commerce, in our transport, in the mines, and in the development of South Africa. And the issue always was trying to reconcile South Africa's two white tribes in terms of the English and the Afrikaans or the Boers. And Jan Smuts knew in the back of his mind, still troubling him from that agreement at Vereniging in 1902, was how to include the black people of South Africa in the final franchise of South Africa's future. You must understand that a huge number of Indians had been brought on from India to work on the sugarcane plantations in Natal, so much so that they outnumbered the white population of Natal. And Smuts was aware that if those Indians, for example, were given the vote, their vote would count far more highly than the white population of Natal. He knew that if black people were given the vote in South Africa, their vote would immediately outweigh and outvote the white vote. And he believed very strongly in the virtues of Western civilization and Western Christianity. And he believed that the future of South Africa lay in the creation of those virtues, and as such, in his mind, given the time period we're referring to, lay in the leadership of the white tribes or the white race, so to speak. You must understand that Jan Smuts had written a book called Walt Whitby, which is a book about the personality of humankind. He was a man who believed that evolution was really a series of processes, and in its highest manifestation was that of the personality of a human being. He was a man who understood holism, a very complex subject that I don't understand in any way. Winston Churchill, who had great respect for Smuts, was to say, "I have looked at your book in awe," indicating clearly that he never read it as he couldn't understand it and had put it aside. And isn't it wonderful to consider that Einstein once said that Jan Smuts was one of 11 people only that he ever encountered who understood fully the theory and the idea of relativity. So there's no doubting that Jan Smuts was a man who had this quite incredible intellect. I think he would have been part of Mensa today, unusually high IQ, a man who didn't suffer fools easily, and a man who probably as a result lacked some EQ, as we would call it today, public relations, his interaction with fellow human beings. He was intrigued by people who could spend time playing cards. He felt that that was a waste of time. He'd rather be acquiring knowledge and reading and having detailed conversations with folks on various subjects rather than frittering away his time playing cards. And yet, the flip side of it was he spent a great deal of time walking, either walking with family or friends or walking alone, obviously exercising that great mind. And I think in it all, one might think that Louis Botha's friend, Jan Smuts, had no sense of humor, but he certainly did. Isn't it wonderful that an elderly woman said to him one day, "Isn't evolution the most incredible thing?" And Jan Smuts, with a touch of irony, said, "Yes, indeed. Isn't it wonderful that the good Lord gave us ears to hang spectacles upon?" And that poor woman never understood the irony of the situation. Isn't it intriguing to consider that whilst they were in German East Africa, Tanganyika, in the First World War, they had their bivouac or temporary camp, the men all sleeping close together in a ring, Jan Smuts and his second in command within that ring, and sentries placed outside the circle, and the sentries had to challenge any sound with "Who goes there?" and immediately retire to the ring, and the ring or circle of men could then fire out, covering the perimeter with a 360-degree field of fire. Well, this one sentry was obviously very nervous, and after 3 false alarms, with them having fired into the darkness, having challenged a sound 3 times. Young Smuts said calmly to his second in command, Pete, would you mind taking your revolver and shooting that sentry? Otherwise we're not going to get any rest tonight. I always thought that that was just a fantastic story about Jan Smuts. Well, Jan Smuts's party, the United Party, had mixed fortunes. He, on account of his continual wish to include non-whites in the franchise of South Africa, created a very, very mixed response from South Africans. The Liberals felt he was a reactionary, and the right-wingers, the Conservatives, felt he was far too much of a Liberal. You know, Jan Smuts had huge thoughts for South Africa. He always wanted to include Southwest Africa, German Southwest Africa, into the South African territory. He wanted the South African territory to extend as far north as the Zambezi River, which was quite a grand scheme. And within that scheme, he had designed and created in his mind the dream of a great transfrontier game reserve called Dongala. Now, we often cycle through what would have been Dongala on the Tour de Tuli mountain bike event, where we ride in southeastern Botswana, southwestern Zimbabwe, and the far northern reaches of South Africa. Well, the Nat Party in 1948 put pay to that plan immediately, and all that is left of Jan Smuts's great transfrontier game reserve is a game reserve called Mapungubwe, which is solely in South African territory, south of the Limpopo River, in the far north of our country. Well, Jan Smuts would see, unfortunately, a situation he was violently opposed. He had strong views and support of the Jewish nation, and more about that in a short while. But isn't it tragic to consider that they were eventually saying that a vote for the United Party was akin to a vote for Stalin and the communists? And the Nats were creating more and more support in this country. I think that Jan Smuts lost touch with the fact that he was a great international statesman and was concentrating too much on matters abroad rather than matters at home. And between 1939 and 1945, in the Second World War, when he was once again Prime Minister in South Africa, he was hugely involved with world affairs, the creation indeed of the League of Nations. He was the only signatory from the United Nations to indeed sign the League of Nations. He was incredibly involved at the time with the development too of the Commonwealth, feeling that it was far better with his old scheme of holism that these countries be included into a greater whole, that he would become known as the Commonwealth. Well, 1948 was a very seminal year for the great Jan Smuts. Do you know that on his 78th birthday, the 24th of May of 1948, the State of Israel was created? Remember his support of the Jews? Do you know that he had supported the Jews strongly enough that when they voted in Parliament for the inclusion of Jews in South Africa and for the immigration of Jews to South Africa, there was a 100% vote in favor of? He was very strongly involved in the United Nations partition of the Holy Land between the Jews and the Arabs. And then, to add to the woes, in 1948, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. Jan Smuts said he was one of the great men of my time, and although they had been opposed on many issues, they had a great respect for one another. Gandhi had once given Smuts a pair of leather sandals he'd handmade. Jan Smuts, towards the end of his life, would give them back to Gandhi and was absolutely horrified at the assassination of Gandhi. And then in that year, at the polling stations, the United Party, Smuts's party, won 65 votes against 70 votes for the National Party, and with it the National Party, with its inherent policy of apartheid under Malan, Verwoerd and others, would become entrenched as the leaders in South Africa. Isn't it tragic to consider that on the 10th of September of 1948, Jan Smuts' son Jopi died of a brain hemorrhage and brain meningitis. Jan and his wife, Izzy, never recovered from her untimely death. And isn't it wonderful to consider with Jan Smuts' involvement with Britain, his war against the British forces in the Anglo-Boer War, that after the Anglo-Boer War, he would buy the officers' mess from Middelburg that had been created there by his arch-rival Horatio Kitchener as a family home, and have it dismantled and transported to Irene outside of Pretoria, where this huge dwelling was erected. It had a veranda around 3/4 of the home, and because it was prefabricated, the walls within the home could easily be moved to change the inner space within that house. And I've always been staggered by the fact that at its height it had 14 bedrooms. The Smutses love having family and friends around. The place was apparently a hive of noise and very, very untidy, outside of the fact that in the centre of the house was Jan's library, his sanctuary. And apparently when he was in there, quiet was required, and nobody was allowed to disturb him in his inner sanctum, the library. He used to sleep until it was too cold on the veranda of that home. He spent much time walking across the veld, studying the grasses and the trees and the animals of this country. And the family who always knew him as Obas, I think for them, their place of refuge and sanctuary outside of the farms, of which he owned a number, was always Irene and the house that they held at that place outside of Pretoria. Well, Winston Churchill, who often considered Jan Smuts as his right-hand man, and indeed all of Churchill's council and his parliament, said that the only person he would ever take advice from was Jan Smuts. And Jan Smuts kept himself very healthy and fit and slim. He drank very little, he ate very healthily, and he was always concerned about his great friend Winston's lack of healthy habits in his life, in terms of smoking heavily, drinking heavily, not sleeping enough, certainly not eating in a healthy manner. Well, isn't it ironic to consider that after all that, Winston Churchill would outlive our man Jan Smuts by 10 years. Jan Smuts was called to rest finally in 1950, only 2 years after that seminal year of 1948 and the United Party's loss to the Nationalists, and Jan Smuts knowing that the black people were not going to be given a piece of the franchise of South Africa. It probably broke that great South African ambassador's heart. And I'd like to read to you, if I may, a little piece spoken by Winston Churchill about his great friend Jan Smuts on the occasion of his death. Winston Churchill writes, "My own recollections of him go back more than 50 years. A half-century of ever-growing respect and personal affection, in which his renown increased steadily to his present great and secure place in history. I would wish to remember him in the words I used once in Parliament. He did not belong to any single state or nation. He fought for his own country, and he thought for the whole world." I hope you've enjoyed that little interdict. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.